I'm away, yeah. So dairy industry, you're now part of a global industry. And the truth is that you're just going to have to get used to working with the vicissitudes of the short-term fluctuations. And I'll endeavour to demonstrate to you that as I go along. Second thing is that you now have something in common with the oil industry. Small mismatches between supply and demand at a world level lead to vast changes in the prices you receive. And there isn't going to be much you're going to be able to do about that other than what I talk about as I go along. And finally, over and above the cyclical events that will fall on your industry every, in a pattern, you have to deal with the longer term. Farming is a long-term enterprise. There are underlying trends that are going to have profound changes for not just you, but for farmers across the world. I describe it as a trilemma. The world is going to need to consume a great deal more food as its population increases, and indeed the affluence of the world's population rises. But at the same time, you're going to have to deal with growing scarcity of natural resources, and agriculture is an industry that uses or depends heavily on natural resources. And you're going to have to deal with the consequences of climate change. So if you're going to succeed in the future, you've got to deal with these short-term fluctuations and plan how you're going to deal with the underlying trend. Here's a little graph. Probably you don't need any reminding of this. This is the Food and Agricultural Organization's dairy price index, and what I hope you can see is there has been a big increase in volatility over recent years. And if I was to superimpose on this graph the UK wholesale price for butter, you can see a very high correlation between the two. And if I were to add other dairy products, it all looks a bit like spaghetti, but the message is quite clear. What you have now is a very high correlation between world prices and domestic wholesale prices here. What about the recent history of dairy farmers? There's your milk price. You can see increasing volatility, and again, hasn't fluctuated quite as much as the world price, but it is certainly following it. And if you get rid of the world price and take a look at your input costs, you'll see that they fluctuate. And you can see part of your problem really is that a couple of years ago, when prices were so high, not just here, but in other parts of the world, farmers began to expand. And sooner or later, that led to falling prices, and despite the fact that inputs are coming down, we have reached a position where it's not sustainable at the moment. There's going to be change in order to adjust for it. Unfortunately, as feed prices are coming down, unfortunately as others in the world are continuing to expand, just like farmers here, it's going to be quite a long time, probably well over a year, before that graph begins to look more attractive. I don't need to tell you that, China now, their production's up about 4%, I think, this year. Their slowdown in growth has reduced their demand for imports. They've pushed something like 2 to 3 million tons of milk equivalents back onto world markets. Russia's sanctions have pushed back another 2 to 3. So, the world market is now having to deal with a greater supply on the basis of that. Also, the exchange rate has not moved in our favour when compared to some of these other countries. And the truth of the matter is, that's where your problems lie. And bashing retailers and talking about fair prices. If anyone could define a fair price to me, I'll give them a fiver. But, that's not where your future lies. And you don't plan for your industry by thinking you're going to get a short-term break out of the supermarkets. It's your business, you sort it, not relying on others. Okay, and the truth is this. People are going to consume a lot more food in the future. There's going to be 9.3 billion people in the world by 2050, and a lot of them are going to be pretty rich. India alone has a middle class of over 400 million. That's almost as big as Europe. And China is not far behind. These are markets that are there to be taken by the good. And of course, we're talking under the auspices of a company that's already well aware of that and way ahead of me on it. What I would like to see is the industry here getting together with the government and beginning to develop a serious strategy. I know there have been papers put out, you read it, it's nothing more than a wish list. I'd like to see targets set, I'd like to see whose responsibility it is to achieve certain objectives, and I'd like to see us getting on with it. Because we now have an opportunity. If we don't rise to it, others are going to, and then you're going to be left behind. Now's the time to be thinking 5 years ahead. So you need a new mindset. You're going to have to get used to this short-term volatility. Potato farmers got used to it years ago, and they still survive. So can you. And you're going to have to deal with the longer-term opportunities, in particular, sustainability. So here's what I think are the 4 options open to individual farmers. First one's leave the industry. And that will undoubtedly be the right choice for a number of farmers. Perhaps I'm not so concerned with those. I'm more concerned with the other 3. There are those who have what I call an adaptive capability. They're in a position, perhaps they're not particularly efficient at the moment, or they haven't been making the most of the opportunities whereby they can increase their productivity, thereby lowering their unit cost of production, and or increase their returns. Perhaps tucked away in here are a few farmers who might go from being conventional farmers to organic farmers. But as you've already been told, you don't want to oversupply your organic market. That was a big mistake you made some years ago in your profound belief that the world was just waiting for organic milk. No, it's not. There's a niche market there that's prepared to drink organic milk, and that's the way it will always be. Is that controversial enough for you? Then there are farms who have what I call a buffer capability. These are the market leaders. These are the people who have high levels of efficiency or very good market returns or whatever. They're in a position where they can withstand these short-term shocks. They're the people who earn a return each year, and they're the people who have invested in their future. And then there's another group of farms. I call them, they have the transformative capability. For this, I mean they're going to either take on they're going to diversify, they're going to take on another farm enterprise, or they're going to vertically diversify into a new product. Now, what's the point here? This can be extremely profitable, but it's incredibly high risk, and the chances of failure, therefore, are very high, and the chances of ending up in even greater debt are very high. But for those who can do it successfully, it certainly is a way to think about the future, and if you do it successfully, it actually generates this buffer capability. You can put up with these vicissitudes of prices because you are shielded to a large extent from them. So, diversification. Horizontal diversification, you add another farm enterprise. It doesn't need to be an animal-based one. I was listening to the radio this morning about a farm that was, was using heather to create whatever it is you stick on plants. I've forgotten. What? Pollen. Get away, my girl. Equivalent manure. It comes in bags. You shove it. Anyway, there's an enterprise, and it's what happens when you get to my age, you forget these things. And horizontal diversification, of course, I'm really thinking about moving downstream into producing another product. The point about horizontal diversification is if you're going to do it, you've got to have the capacity, so you've got to have the land, and you've got to have the capabilities. And secondly, of course, you need an enterprise, ideally, that is counter-cyclical. You don't want an enterprise whose prices are likely to be falling the same time as milk. It just so happens at the moment beef prices are rising at the time and milk prices are down. But it's not that easy to find an enterprise that is counter-cyclical. But here's my point. If you think this is a substitute for inefficiency, for low productivity, well, it isn't. Because wherever you're going to be in farming in the future, you've got to be good. You've got to be efficient, and you've got to be very clued up to the market opportunities. So don't think there's a solution by just turning your current talents in another direction. If you're not good enough, perhaps you should think about leaving the industry. And then we've got vertical diversification. Now, I've said this offers great opportunities to farmers, but again, you've got to have the capability. Suppose you decide to jump on this bandwagon for artesian cheeses. And, some people have done this incredibly successfully. But You've got to have the capability to produce a distinctive cheese, or ice cream, or whatever it is you're going for. You've got to have the ability to sell it. You've got to be able to find the markets for it and to be able to plan for that. This is high risk. And in truth, only a few farmers can possibly succeed at it. It cannot be a general solution. But for those who are good at it, I admire them. Most farmers will continue to sell to independent processors or cooperatives. But if we're going to capture the opportunities that are becoming available on world markets, what we need is much greater supply chain integration. I'm going to talk a great deal about supply chain today because that's a whole different exercise. But for many years, I have heard people in the food industry talking about supply chain integration and how we need to work together and trust each other. And I do not know of an industry where there seems to be less trust in the supply chain than in agriculture. It's a shocking state of affairs, and it needs to be addressed properly rather than people just talking about it and carrying on. Okay, so we have a strategic challenge facing the industry at the moment, and it behoves all stakeholders, not just farmers, but their buyers and retailers as well, and the government, okay, to get their acting gear and to start to move forward. And I use those words, well, I try to force these words upon it. I think you need to accept you've got a common purpose, you need to align your objectives, and you need to do it with a sense of urgency because you're getting left behind. Others are ahead of you. They're already doing this, and we are still looking inwards rather than looking outwards. The opportunities are not going to be, well, they are going to be domestic, but they're going to be far more out there in the real world in the future, and that's where you need to be thinking in partnership with someone, or perhaps if you've got your own integrated business. Well, most of those are already doing it. I know they're way ahead. But that's what the whole industry has got to be thinking about. How do I capture those new growing markets? Because I'm good at producing milk. I produce a high quality product. But somehow or other, I'm sitting here bashing the supermarkets while the world is moving on over the horizon. Okay? I do think farmers get a rough deal out of the supply chain very often. They're expected to take all the risks, and that doesn't work. If you have proper supply chain integration, there is a sharing of risks. Many years ago, I was rather proud. I built the Marks and Spencer's pricing model for them, which I'm rather glad to say is still producing 33 pence a litre. And that came down to understanding a sharing of risk. And the biggest problem I had with that was persuading farmers to accept it. They just couldn't believe it. They just thought it was a trick. They kept looking up my sleeve to wait for what trick was coming out. It's a sad state of affairs, really. But do you know what I had to do? I had to go to the younger farmers in the end, because they got it rather quickly, and I had to get them to persuade the older guys that this was a good deal for them. Okay. So supply chain relationships are important, but my focus is actually looking down at the individual farm here, okay? But and what I want to look at is what you need to do at a farm level to survive and prosper in this global dairy industry. Okay. Now, productivity. I am a big fan of productivity. Productivity technically is the amount of output you get for the amount of inputs you put in. It is the source of efficiency. It is a major influence on your unit costs of production, and in a world where we're talking about sustainability, it is also a major driver of ecological sustainability. You need highly productive farms if you're going to be efficient in both market terms and in sustainability terms, okay? Let's ignore scale for the moment. What I call a distinctive productivity is the ability, given the same resources as another farm, to produce at a much lower unit cost. It isn't necessarily that you have a higher yield, it's that ratio of output to input that matters. And what I do know is that those that do it best, it is ultimately based on superior knowledge. These people, by experience, by the experiences they've had, by experimentation, and by good management, have found a way to drive their costs way below their competitors. I sit on Farm Business's judging panel for the Cream Awards, and you see some of the farm accounts that come through there. You realise just what is possible by farmers who are really on top of their game. It costs down to 21 pence a litre and things like that. Really very good. So it can be done. Truth of the matter is that dairy farming involves economies of scale. Truth is, all other factors remaining equal, larger farms have an advantage over smaller farms. Their unit costs are going to be lower than their rivals. So the ideal state of affairs, of course, is to achieve both distinctive productivity and larger scale. Here's just a couple of graphs to set the scene for take that a little further. This is milk yields in this country. The underlying rate of growth, and it's been calculated from way back in the 70s there, is about 1.6% a year. Year in, year out, the yield per cow goes up. And the truth of the matter is, if you look at milk production, well, I've just got it back in 1996 there, but where it is today, it's just gone up a bit. If yield per cow is going up at that rate, and if we aren't selling a great deal more milk anywhere, then there has to be an adjustment. And you know what that is? We have to have a reduction in the number of cows. You can see it's turned up a bit at the end there. Well, unfortunately, that's only adding to your problems at the moment. Up goes the yield and up went the cows. But that won't last. It'll soon revert to its long-term trend. Now, if you accept that there are economies of scale in farming, and if you accept that the number of dairy cows is inevitably going to have to come down as yields go up, then it must be that we're going to have a smaller number of farmers. And I've only drawn it here from the mid and 1990s, when there was something like about 36,000 dairy farmers. I was born in the late 1940s. There were then over 200,000 dairy farmers in this country. The average dairy herd was about 17 cows. Sometimes when I hear farmers complaining on the radio about how tough it is, I wonder if they want me to go back to that number of dairy farmers. 200 dairy farmers with 17 cows, is that the ideal for this industry? Trouble is, there isn't a living soul that can tell you how many dairy farmers there should be and what their size should be. You've just got to accept that the market is going to determine that. And just in the last 20 years or so, you can see that the average size of dairy cow has gone up in this country up to about 133, and it will continue to go up. And what this is, and it's happening all the way across Europe, incidentally, this is evidence that there are economies of scale in farming. So I think the evidence is overwhelming. For this industry to be resilient, for this industry to deal with the volatility that's fallen upon it, for this industry to rise to the challenges I've spoken about, we're going to need larger scale farms, highly efficient farms. And incidentally, I'll bet you, if you look carefully at your organic farming sector, you'll find exactly the same lessons apply there. So here we are. Here's a little graph, because I'm an economist and I can't help drawing graphs. It's afraid it goes with the territory. This little bell-shaped curve here represents volatility. So there's your average milk price, and sometimes it might be higher and sometimes it might be lower, but the shape of that curve tells you the probability of it being a great deal higher is rather low, and the probability of it being a great deal lower is rather low, but it's going to be quite a high probability of it jumping around. If I superimpose on that a cost curve, which has its own volatility, and then if I have two sizes of farm, one at A and one at B, you don't need a PhD to know which one is going to be in a much better position to survive in this volatile world. If, however, I can create distinctive productivity, I can get that cost curve down, then the guy at A is going to be in a stronger position. So I'm not saying there aren't going to be a range of farms in the future. I'm just saying the balance of probability is there's going to be fewer of them, and they're going to be larger. Now let's take a look at some of these underlying trends. I've got to keep going because we started a bit late, but I'm already running over my time. The world needs people to produce a lot more food. People say to me, well, you know, we waste a lot of food and we eat too much meat and things like that. Yes, all true, and we should be doing something about that. But if you believe that's going to solve this, you're in cloud cuckoo land. We need an increase, a significant increase in production, and that applies to dairy farming across the world. I'd like to think Britain has some of the best dairy farmers in the world, so why wouldn't you be part of that? We certainly, you rely on feed. You don't, the arable land in the world is declining. And on a per capita basis, it's falling even faster, so we need a big increase in output of arable crops per hectare. Farming depends on fertilizers and energy. Well, fertilizer energy intensive, so we've got to find a way of increasing output per unit of these natural resources. We use an awful lot of fresh water in farming, and particularly in dairy farming, so we've got to find a way of getting more output for less water. We're then, of course, having to deal with climate change, and this impacts on production, particularly of crops, etc., from which you rely. So agriculture has got to reduce its emissions, and it's got to learn to cope with extremes of weather. And, of course, we're now all environmentalists, so farmers have got to take account of the pressures to deliver public goods. Now, I don't believe there's any way of solving these problems other than via sustainable intensification. And notice I said at a global level. I realise some people in this room may take a different view, and I look forward to you trying your luck. What we really need is natural resource productivity. When we talk about productivity, generally we include this, but it's got labour and things like that. And we've had a big focus on getting down the amount of labour, replacing labour with capital. That's not unusual. That's what happens across all industries, really. But natural resource productivity is reducing the amount of output, removing the amount of natural resources and the damage to the environment from producing a given output. And for this you need two things. You need technical efficiency. You need farmers to be highly efficient. I've said that, but you also need capital intensity, I think. And you need technological advance. And where does that come from? That comes from the research institutes and the universities. They bring forward incremental improvements, but every so often you get a drastic improvement, okay? So agro-biotechnological advances, they're going to come from the universities and the research houses, and they're scale neutral, really, if they produce, you know, a new crop or a new animal or whatever, or improve animals' feed conversion ratios or whatever, that's scale neutral. But when it comes to the other side of this, engineering, or what I call precision farming, which is really the fusion of advanced engineering and information and communications technology, I think there's a scale advantage there. Essentially, what you need is to invest in this technique, and for reasons I'll explain in a minute, you get an advantage if you're larger scale. And all of this is going to be underpinned by better management and better human capital. Here's my swipe at the Common Agricultural Policy. But if you think this puts me in the get us out of Europe camp, you couldn't be wrong. Couldn't be more wrong. Just because Europe has a few imperfections, you know, doesn't mean to say that I think that it's all bad. But here's the problem with Europe, and here's the problem that you're all saddled with. I've already explained that curve. There's the sort of average price, if you can take it. So if your price equals your costs, then you're on zero margins, and there's an awful lot of farms in Europe that are in that position. If you're to the right, as you look at that graph of that zero margin point, you're earning a return. You're therefore earning resources that are going to allow you to invest in improving your farm. I don't know of any business that succeeds that doesn't invest. You must have businesses that are capable of investing in their future. If you're a larger scale farm, you seem to have an advantage in terms of earnings, and you also have an advantage in output because you have a larger output over which to spread the costs of this investment. Here's the shocking truth. 80% of farms, it's not dairy farms, this is all farms. 80% of farms in Europe are to the left of that line. If we add on direct payments to them, it only falls to 65%. Most farms in Europe, direct payments, what they're doing is they're nothing more than income augmenting social payments. They don't generate sufficient for these farms to invest in their future, yet they're blocking up the markets which the more efficient, more go-ahead farmers could take. So in that respect, unfortunately, the CAP is holding you back. So I'll leave you with 3 thoughts. You're now part of a global industry. You've no choice but to improve your resilience to short-term fluctuations. No choice. If you don't do it, you're dead. And you've also got to focus very much on becoming internationally competitive. Now, here's the sad thing. In this country here, we've talked about this for years, and we're not very good at it. But agriculture actually has an advantage over many other industries. I can say this with confidence. In agriculture in this country, and people forget, about 80% of the value added in farming comes from just 20% of the farms. Amongst those farmers, we have some of the best in the world. If that isn't a basis for becoming internationally competitive, albeit in a food chain, then I don't know what is. And there's not many other industries that can say that in this country. So agriculture has enormous opportunity if only it can see it and seize it. Vertical diversification is an opportunity for some, and you've got an example with the host of this conference today, someone who's done it extremely successful. You heard in the introduction sort of things they've done. They've gone out and they've found new markets with new products, and that's why they're winning. But the truth is, that isn't the solution for everyone because they don't have the capabilities to do it. And anyway, if everyone tried to do it, the price would just collapse and it'd be a disaster. Okay? But nevertheless, whether vertically diversifying or moving into partnerships with people who are prepared to do that and move forward with you, then that's what you should be thinking about doing. And I'm afraid the evidence is pretty conclusive. We need to restructure the industry. In other words, what I'm really saying is we're going to have fewer farmers in the future. And once you recognise that, perhaps the sooner it happens, the better. I take an industry view, and I know that's a luxury for me. I'm not an individual farmer. But I think an industry composed of fewer, larger-scale farms who are focused on the things I've talked about in this, you have an enormous advantage over many other countries. So do not let Ireland and other ones pull ahead of you. And if you want to be ahead of them, or perhaps it's almost catch up with Ireland, I'm afraid. If you really want to get ahead in this industry, you need to be thinking now about the next 5 years and the things I've said to you. Thank you very much.